If you're a regular listener to this show, we wanted to say thank you. Without the Lord's help and without you, we wouldn't still be doing this. But we also want you to know that this show wouldn't exist if it weren't for ABWE International and ABWE missionaries like Justin, who's a missionary in a Muslim country in Asia. So let me tell you about him. One day, he was wandering a crowded street doing street evangelism. He'd been doing it every morning for 9 months with no results. He was discouraged. He sat down at an outdoor coffee shop. Local men crowded the table, fraternizing before the start of the workday. Justin tried to start a spiritual conversation with the Muslim man seated next to him, and the man, disinterested, walked off. But before Justin could even process the rejection, he heard a voice speaking to him in broken English. The voice said, "You said sins forgiven. How?" It was another Muslim man who had been sitting next to him who was listening silently the whole time. Justin, knowing the dangers of doing evangelism openly in this country, started to whisper to him about Jesus. They crept closer and closer until they were inches apart. They were looking around for danger the whole time. Justin whispered the gospel into this man's ear, and the man grabbed him by the shoulders, pushed him back, and said, "Many of us want to know this message, but we're not allowed to ask." That's what life is like in a country where evangelism is illegal, and more than 130 ABWE workers like Justin are serving in places like this. Every gift to ABWE's Global Gospel Fund goes to critical staffing, support, training, and services to advance the gospel to the lost and unreached through faithful workers like Justin. So learn more and become a partner with ABWE at abwe.org/partner. That's abwe.org/partner. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Communications with ABWE, joined by Scott Dunford, West Coast Advancement Coordinator for ABWE and pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. Well, we're back. We are back. For those of you that follow us on social media, you know that we got hacked. And I won't say who we think is responsible, but it's just a world full of people that are hostile to the gospel and just like to mess up websites that are doing stuff like that. Let's just leave it at that, right?
Yeah, we can. We'd like to create a dramatic storyline, and maybe we will. But
it was a fairly sophisticated hack. My friend, who's an expert, tells me. In fact, I think we need to do an episode on digital security and missions. That would actually be. Isn't that on the list of interviews we want to do?
It is on our list, and after we get back from Radius, I think that's something that we're going to get into. I think that's important.
Yes, we're recording this before our Radius event. I think by the time this premieres, it may be after that event. We'll see. I'm not sure what order these are coming out, and we'll figure that out. But we are excited for that. That content is going to be available to you now that we're back up and running in our podcast feed. Now, Scott, with this next guest, though, I'm not sure how much I should call you out. So we were working on getting this scheduled, and then you never invited me. It's well, I guess I did just call you out, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. So
in front of everyone.
There you go.
All 5 of our listeners are now incensed against you.
Well, I'm excited to have our next guest on here. She has written an important book called When Doors Close. She's got an extensive ministry, having served in West Africa, then served all over the Middle East, and has gone through some of her own trials, which I don't want to completely expose. I want them to come out in the interview, but we're really privileged to have as our guest today Carol Ghattas. She's ministering out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, but like I said, spent a long time overseas.
Oh, Murfreesboro, okay. I've got family down there.
And has coming out with a new book called When Doors Close. And so, Carol, welcome to our show. We're so glad to have you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you've served in missions?
Sure. It's so good to be with you all. I appreciate you having me on. Yes, I'm from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. So I'm a Tennessee girl, Southern girl. But most of my life was spent overseas. I went as a short-term worker to West Africa, to Ivory Coast after college. And then after I was married in the year 1990, I can't remember, I went with my husband to the Middle East and North Africa. So we spent 20 years in that region of the world. and had our two sons there. And then we came back in 2009 to retire, we thought. But then the Lord showed us there was more to do as a mosque was being built in my hometown, and people were wondering about Islam and what was going on. And so we began teaching and then began an Arabic speaking church in Murfreesboro, where we served for the last several years doing that. So the Lord has blessed and continues to bless. So that's kind of my life in a nutshell.
So what motivated you to write this book?
So, yes, I really felt like I wanted to pour into the next generation of workers. And I've had a lot of closed doors in my own life over the time from when I was in West Africa through the Middle East and North Africa. And so it was just really a way to share that with others.
So we deal with people going into missions all the time. Both Alex and I have worked in mobilization. Now I'm in the local church side of it, but still doing a lot of things with mobilization. And when we talk to young missionaries or people going into missions for the first time, and I remember feeling this way, it's all optimism. You know, it's about open doors. It's about God's calling. It's about a clear sense of like, this is what God is going to do. And so we like go forward in full confidence that what God called us to do is going to look almost exactly like what we envisioned it. But as those of us, and certainly you know this, after you've been in ministry for a while, you realize that closed doors are just as much a part of what God is doing in our lives as open doors is a huge part of ministry. So what do new missionaries particularly need to know about closed doors?
I think it's important to see that closed doors do not mean that God is not at work or God has not called you to a certain ministry. Closed doors can sometimes protect us from something that we're not aware of. You know, whether it's not even able to get into a country, sometimes mean it's okay to wait. You might get in later on. You might need to go somewhere else where there's a bigger need. You don't see that from God's perspective. And so I think for me, it's helped to realize that closed doors are God's way of saying either no or not right now, but I've got something else for you. And that's not always easy when you have something in your mind and you want to go that direction. And then you forget, oh, I can't do it now. So what does that mean about God?
We've interviewed other missionaries who've had doors shut on them very suddenly. We had an interview with John Clausen a year or two ago on that same topic. So what advice do you give to missionaries like that who've had their world suddenly turned upside down on them?
A lot of it depends on what the situation is, but always just to say, stop and step back for a minute. You know, try not to allow your emotions to move you to make the next decision too quickly. Realize that God is still in control. Obviously, he's sovereign over even this closed door. And so sometimes we react out of an emotional feeling that something's happened and we begin to doubt, or we make a decision too quickly to go somewhere else or to change or whatever. But we do need to step back and give God margin to show us what is next. And I think that to me is a critical point.
So practically speaking, what does that look like? I mean, I don't know if, a missionary would think, well, I'm making an emotional decision, right? I think they would feel rightly that the stakes are high, that these are eternal things, that they've been sent, commissioned by a church, many of them having raised support to go to a particular place in a ministry. I think someone might say, well, I'm not making an emotional decision, but there's some weighty things to think through here. So what practically would it look like for a person like that to slow down, and what other filters should they be thinking through?
Well, I'll give you an example. When we had a door closed early in our ministry, we needed to leave a country in 10 days. We only had 10 days to make a decision and to move forward or to do, we had to leave. We immediately went to colleagues that were in the same country that were able to stop and pray with us. They had experience in having to leave a country before. And so we actually had time with them to pray and to see about what we could do next. We needed that support. So I think one thing practically you need to do is to gather around you, whether it's in country or overseas, somebody that can really pray with you and say, I need you to know that this is happening. Help us to be able to focus on what's next. That's one practical thing I think you can do.
So you actually spend a lot of time in the book kind of going through different ways that doors closed, and I think right now, the missionaries that I'm talking to, I've seen probably a dozen missionaries in the last couple of weeks that are stuck in a way, because of COVID, and then because of government responses to COVID and our government's response to other countries. And it creates this kind of cycle. You talk about doors closed by funding, doors closed through government issues, doors closed through health concerns. There's so many different ways in which doors can get closed. What do you think are some of the hardest things for missionaries to deal with those closed doors?
I think that one of the hardest things is being pushed to go somewhere that maybe you don't want to go for the next step. And, I've had to leave a country quickly and go somewhere where we were not accepted and where people didn't want us. And you think, Lord, why did you take me out of a place that was, fruitful, and you bring me to a place where no one even wants us? But then in that season, when I was in that location, I had children. We were able to do some teaching. Some other good things happened, but it was a short time. And I always looked at those kind of periods as a season of pause in some ways. I was still ministering. I was still seeing God bless, but it was different from the place that I had been kicked out of. And so I try to look back at those experiences and say, okay, did you do anything good in this? And he did.
I have friends that were suddenly kicked out of a place, and we ended up leaving our overseas ministry before all of that happened. But our friends, they were forcibly removed from the situation. And when I talked to them, there was a deep sense of loss and even depression that they felt coming out of that. Is that common, you think, with missionaries, especially to see a real sudden change, whether that's through the death of a spouse, death of a child, or in a dramatic situation where the police show up at your door one day and you are immediately taken to the airport and sent home?
Absolutely. I think closure or lack of closure is a huge cause of depression, um, just a feeling of guilt. Sometimes you've had to leave not because you wanted to, but because you got kicked out for whatever the reason was. And who knows what happens to the people you leave behind. And it begins to make you doubt whether God's got them, And so now with the internet and things, we're much more connected with the people we leave behind, or we can be sometimes. And that has helped, to be able to say, we can still talk, but we also do have to cut the cord sometimes to ourselves to say, you are in God's hands, and I'm going to trust you into God's hands, whether it's working with other people, or just providing resources for them in other ways. But it is hard, and it is a cause of depression. That's why you need to be talking to someone always. When you come out of a situation like that, you need to have a team around you or others to help you with it.
Now, there's a lot more that we can dive into there in terms of those painful transitions, and we can do that. But I want to zoom out just for a second. And Scott, forgive me, I know you were going to ask this. I'm going to kind of steal a little bit of your thunder. Everyone, whether you're a missionary goer or a sender, whether you've had an easy go of it in an open country, or whether you've had one of these dramatic situations, everyone's dealt with transition and loss on a broader level, right? You may not have been dragged out of a country kicking and screaming or lost your visa, but everyone's had to deal with transitions and different seasons moving from one to another. So how does a missionary leave well under any circumstances. I even think through to my own path that the Lord has used to bring me here. And even just leaving a church staff was a really hard thing.
Yes, that is so true. I think one of the greatest things that you can give the people that you leave behind is empowerment, to say, what I was doing among you, you can do. So whether you intentionally begin that from the beginning by teaching them and giving them opportunities to lead, you're basically working yourself out of a job. You want to empower them. And I've watched it, when we've had to leave quickly, and I've watched it when we left purposefully a country where we said, it is now in your hands to do this job. So giving them the tools to do that, but just also verbally saying to them, you are doing now, you're carrying on the task that God wants for this country, and it is in your hands. And you'll see shoulders raise, and, you can see them take it on because they know that they've been empowered, because you're not coming top down anymore. You're saying, we are in this together. And I think that's the biggest blessing you can leave behind.
I know that as a pastor that went to the mission field, that transition was more difficult than I ever imagined. I thought actually my pastoral ministry would equip me well, and it did equip me well in many ways. But it created a challenge in that the things that I was used to being able to just do and show leadership and have the respect of people was like had to be re-earned, And I see that with missionaries transitioning back as well, where people that were functioning at very high levels of ministry come back into the local church and just kind of flounder a little bit and not really sure how to lead or where to step out. And what would you say? Because you've done that a couple different ways. You came back from you've gone through that transition both multiple times in different countries. You went through what you thought was going to be retirement, and then you had to go through another transition in losing your husband. What kind of advice would you give to missionaries that are kind of dealing with like, okay, now I have that next step of ministry, and how do I engage here when maybe people don't even know what I'm good at doing and don't respect all the work that I've done in the past?
Well, I think some of that is just from the way I'm hearing you even ask the question, is we have a tendency sometimes to put ourselves up on a pedestal, and we have to be careful for that. That I need to remember that I'm part of the body, the whole body. And so it's not that I'm coming from a position of greatness. I want to be part of the body. So I want to put myself in a place of service and make myself available to other people. But that takes relationships and it takes time. You need to earn their trust. But also, even prior to that, I learned several times through transitions that we need to find space. And especially after the death of my husband, I realized, because I was working, I kept going and going in ministry, and I didn't realize that I needed time to grieve. And it's the same after leaving the field. You need some time to go through that grief process of separation from what you've known and what you've been doing and the 24/7 of ministry, to where you need to kind of also find rest in the Lord. And He gives you that. So I always say, don't rush into making a decision to serve anywhere when you transition.
And that can be really hard for us as pragmatic North Americans who want to feel useful, want to feel productive, to just rest in your identity in Christ, to be like, I'm going to wait. I'm going to allow myself time to heal, to be restored, to grow, whatever that is, to rest, those sorts of things. The last section of your book is pitfalls and action plans. So Scott talked about some of the mistakes that we tend to make, and one of them thinking far too highly of ourselves, putting ourselves on that pedestal. But what are some other mistakes that you see from missionaries that are going through painful transitions, or missionaries just dealing with transitional seasons in general? And how can we avoid those by putting our eyes on Christ?
I think one of the things is to avoid the "it's not fair" trap. That's one of my chapters in that last section. One is questioning God first of all. Really, did you really want me to come back to the States at this time? I really don't want to be in the States. I have some friends that are struggling with that right now. um, I just don't want to be here. Americans don't care about missions. They don't know the need. Why am I here? Um, and you just begin to blame God for that and struggle. Where instead of looking to see what is God trying maybe to teach you, or maybe He wants you to learn something during that time. I always feel like many times in times of transition, take advantage of perhaps an opportunity you couldn't have had if you were not in that place, you know. So trying to get over there, and also being careful not to feel guilty about lost opportunities. I think that is one of the biggest pitfalls, that we feel so guilty that we've left. We're not able to follow up with the people that we were in conversation with about Christ. And we just don't know what to do with that. And we don't realize we need to give it to God. God has to have control over that. So those are a couple of the pitfalls.
You know, Scott, you've experienced this in your time on the mission field. I was not the missionary here, so you can probably speak to this far better than I can. But as Carol's explaining some of this, I'm being reminded of what it was like for me to transition away from my time as a full-time youth pastor and doing student ministry and doing some adult pastoral work as well in our local church context. And one of the things that the Lord used deeply to minister to me was Acts chapter 20. And as Paul is saying farewell to the Ephesian elders, and he says basically, hey, I've run my race. My conscience is clean. Your blood is on your own heads. And be careful, because wolves are going to rise up from your midst, right? But I proclaim to you the whole counsel of God, and I didn't cease, right, teaching you and exhorting you day and night. And he says all these sorts of things. But the Lord used that in a really particular way in my life to remind me, these aren't my sheep. These are His sheep. And I've done my level best. I'm not going to say that I couldn't have done anything better, but in the time that I was shepherding, I've done my level best to teach the whole counsel of God's word. But God is sovereign over the outcomes with them. And it's funny because we get really fired up in our theological circles about the sovereignty of God and salvation. And we talk about those things, but it's hard emotionally to embrace that when you're saying farewell to a group of people that you've almost come to believe that you really are uniquely responsible for in a particular way. And you are responsible, and yet God gives the growth. He's the Lord of the harvest. Did God kind of take you through a similar journey, Scott?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think Carol, you picked up on it. Like there was huge areas of pride that every single transition revealed in my life. And I had to learn, one, that God uses these periods of transition to humble me and make me more usable for His service. But also causes me to trust in Him. And it's even exciting when we do see God use us in ways we weren't expecting, or through those transitions where we feel really not at our peak, and all of a sudden we see God bringing fruit, and we realize, okay, it really allows God to take all the credit and keeps us from being able to boast in our strengths. Instead, we get to boast in our weakness and boast in our God. So yeah, for sure, I as painful as the transitions have been, and we almost have as many moves as you do, Carol, under our belt, and yet through it all, you just see God's faithfulness, and you kind of build that biography of God in your life that just really allows you to rest in Him, even when horrible things seem to be happening. I love what you use this phrase, you use this little line, and maybe it's just the subheadings, but talk about moving first, analyze later, and don't compare or grow bitter. That was in that section, and I when I saw that challenged me, because there's either a tendency to get paralyzed and not do anything, or to overanalyze every move. And then you compare. I mean, I feel like there's always that struggle. I see a lot of missionary couples and families, and MKs that listen, I think would say this. It's easy to kind of like you're forced to come back to the States, and it's like, man, that place was better, and I had my friends were there, and America does everything stupid, and or vice versa. Like I really want to be home, and I wish I could be back with my family celebrating Christmas. Instead, I'm watching it on a Zoom call. I'm assuming that some of those lines came out of personal experience. How did God teach you through some of those things? How did you learn those lessons?
Well, sometimes I'll learn them the hard way. I'll just say that for the short answer. But really, I think it's that whole time that sometimes you do not have time to analyze it. And I'm an analytical person. I like to think through everything. It's sometimes hard to sleep because my mind is going. And yet, when you have to move fast, you just have to go and then take that next step, whether it's you've had to move out of the country and so you're in a temporary place, then just take that time to say, okay, God, I don't have any idea why this had to happen, but I'm just going to stop and let you deal with it. And you will start showing me what I need to know. And I think sometimes our problem is that we want to know why it had to happen. And God doesn't always tell us that. He doesn't always make that clear, and we may not know until glory. But I think like you said, it's a humbling experience, I think, in every one of those things. And, now that I think about it, when you said it, sometimes maybe the reason we move so much is to keep us humble and to not be the ones in charge all the time. And so he keeps us guessing and surprised by his actions and surprised at what we learn so that we can say, it's God, it's not me. And so I think that, just learning that lesson is, yes, it's a hard lesson to learn, but it's one that is wonderful when we realize how good our God is and what he saves us from many times, which is just ourselves.
Amen. And we're not entitled to be in ministry. Again, we think we're entitled to this. It's our full self-actualization. And yet God is perfectly content using these things to refine us. And he cares sometimes a lot more about our sanctification than our productivity. And man, it's hard to admit, but that's the truth. Carol, how can people find out more about you and connect with you and get their hands on this particular book?
Oh, thank you for that. I would love for them to come to my website, which is lifeinexile.net, lifeinexile.net. They can see all my books. I have a blog there. I do blog on Mondays, every Monday, about missions. So they can always check out my Mission Monday blog. But lifeinexile.net has contact information and my book information as well.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Carol. Go ahead and check that out. And if this has been useful to you, or maybe you just know a missionary going through it right now, share it with them. And what also helps this content appear in front of others who can be blessed by it is leaving us a positive review and a 5-star rating in your podcast platform of choice. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. Like us, follow us on social media. And until next week, thank you for listening.